If you sign that, you're not closing a deal, you're giving your company away. The words didn't echo loudly, but they landed with a precision that cut through the room like a fine crack in glass, subtle yet impossible to ignore, and for half a second, the entire boardroom hesitated, not in agreement, not in belief, but in confusion, because the voice hadn't come from the table, not from the row of tailored suits or the legal team lined with tablets and polished confidence, but from the far edge near the service door, where no one important ever stood, where a girl in a faded gray hoodie and scuffed sneakers now found herself held lightly but firmly by two security guards, guiding her toward the exit as if correcting a mistake that should have never existed in the first place. And yet she didn't resist, her posture steady, chin slightly raised, eyes not defiant but certain, as though she had already accepted what was about to happen next. Richard Coleman didn't look at her at first, his attention still resting on the document in front of him, a 72-page merger agreement worth just over $2 billion, the kind of deal that reshaped industries and secured legacies, the kind of deal that rooms like this were built for, and yet something about the interruption lingered, not in the room, but in his mind, faint, like a sound you're not sure you heard, while around him the others shifted subtly, a few glances exchanged, one quiet scoff barely concealed, because to them she was exactly what she appeared to be, nothing more than the janitor's daughter who had wandered too far past where she belonged, someone who cleaned the same glass walls that now reflected their composed expressions, someone invisible until she spoke. Ava Johnson didn't look back as they moved her closer to the door, the soft rubber soles of her shoes brushing against the marble floor in a rhythm that felt louder than it should have, each step measured, controlled. As if she refused to let the moment shrink her, and just before the door opened she said it again, not louder, not sharper, but clearer. Page 32, Section C, third paragraph. And this time Richard's pen stopped, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to react, but enough for him to feel the shift in his own hand, a pause that shouldn't have been there, while the attorney across from him continued speaking, outlining timelines, projections, safeguards, all the language of certainty that filled rooms like this, and yet the numbers blurred for a second, replaced by a single line he hadn't fully examined, not because he couldn't, but because he hadn't needed to, not until now, and the door behind Ava closed with a soft, controlled click, sealing the room again, restoring its order, its hierarchy, its sense of control, or at least the illusion of it, and for a moment everything returned to normal, the voices resumed, the pens moved, the deal continued forward, but something had already shifted, something small and precise, like a single loose thread in a perfectly tailored suit, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore once seen, and Richard Coleman, who had built his reputation on never missing details, felt it there, waiting, quiet but undeniable. The hallway outside the boardroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of artificial chill that clung to polished surfaces and fluorescent light, and Ava Johnson stood still just beyond the closed door, her hands relaxed at her sides, not fidgeting, not trembling, just waiting as if she had nowhere else she needed to be, while the two security guards exchanged a brief glance before stepping a few feet away, their posture shifting from urgency to routine now that the disruption had been handled, and for a moment no one spoke, not to her, not about her, because in buildings like this silence was often the easiest way to erase someone. Down the corridor, the faint hum of elevators and distant conversation blended into a low mechanical rhythm, but Ava's focus did not drift, her eyes resting on the reflective surface of the wall where the boardroom door sat flush and imposing. A barrier that had just been closed on her without hesitation, and yet she did not look rejected, only thoughtful, as if replaying something in her mind that mattered far more than the way she had been escorted out. Hours earlier, the world had been simpler, predictable in the quiet way her nights always were, moving alongside her mother through empty offices with a cart that rattled softly over carpet transitions, the scent of industrial cleaner lingering in the air, and Ava had followed the same pattern she always did, wiping surfaces, organizing stray papers, keeping her head down, but she noticed things she always had, not because she was trying to, but because her mind did not know how to ignore details once they appeared, and when she saw the draft agreement left partially exposed on the conference table, its pages slightly misaligned as if someone had stepped away in a hurry. Something in her paused, not curiosity exactly, but recognition, the kind that came from years of reading materials far beyond what anyone expected from a girl in her position. She had not learned from classrooms alone, though she had once earned a place in one. A scholarship that had promised a different path until hospital bills and long nights beside her mother's bed quietly replaced it, but the learning never stopped. It only changed location, shifting from lecture halls to library corners, from professors to case studies she studied on borrowed time, and contracts like this one were not just documents to her, they were patterns, structures of intention hidden behind formal language, and when she scanned that page, her eyes did not move randomly, they followed the logic, tracing clauses the way others might follow a map, until something broke the pattern, a line that did not align with the rest, subtle enough to be missed by someone rushing, but clear to someone who understood how risk was disguised. Now, back in the present, she inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lungs, and leaned lightly against the wall, not in defeat, but in patience, because she knew something that the people inside that room did not yet fully grasp. And she also knew how long it might take for them to see it, because truth, especially the kind buried in legal language, did not announce itself loudly. It waited. It revealed itself only when someone finally looked closely enough, and inside that room, someone had just started to look. Inside the boardroom, the air had shifted in a way no one openly acknowledged, yet everyone felt it in the subtle pauses between sentences, in the way a few executives leaned slightly forward instead of back, in the way the rhythm of confident agreement began to fracture into something quieter, more cautious. And Richard Coleman sat at the head of the table with the contract still open before him, his pen resting lightly between his fingers, no longer moving, his eyes fixed on a single section that had moments ago meant nothing and now demanded everything, while across from him, the lead attorney continued speaking in a steady, practiced tone, outlining risk mitigation strategies and projected growth curves, but the words no longer landed with the same authority. Because Richard was no longer listening to the voice, he was reading the structure, tracing the sentence Ava had pointed to without ever touching the page. And what he saw was not immediately alarming, not in isolation, because it was written with precision, layered with qualifiers and conditional phrasing that softened its edges, but when placed within the larger framework of the agreement, it shifted weight in a way that was deeply unbalanced, transferring liability under specific post-merger conditions in a manner that was almost invisible unless you followed the chain of responsibility all the way through. One of the board members cleared his throat, asking a question about timeline assurances, and another flipped through his own copy of the document, still confident, still composed, because to them the deal remained solid, backed by months of negotiation and teams of analysts. But Richard's gaze did not move, his thumb pressing lightly against the margin as if anchoring himself to the exact line where the logic began to unravel, and for the first time that morning, he felt something unfamiliar in this room, not doubt exactly, but interruption, the sense that a detail had slipped past the filters he trusted. The representative from the opposing firm, seated 3 chairs down, adjusted his cufflinks with a calm that bordered on rehearsed, his expression neutral, attentive, patient, the posture of someone who knew the outcome was already secured, and that subtle confidence did not go unnoticed. It lingered in the background like a quiet signal, and Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he turned one page back, then forward again, mapping the clauses against each other, searching for alignment that no longer held. A junior associate leaned in toward the attorney, whispering something too low to catch, and the attorney nodded once before continuing, but the cadence had changed, just slightly. Just enough to reveal that the certainty in the room was no longer unanimous, and Richard finally spoke, not loudly, not with authority, but with precision, asking for clarification on the specific clause Ava had mentioned, and the attorney paused, only for a fraction of a second, before responding with a carefully constructed explanation that sounded correct, sounded complete, and yet did not fully resolve the imbalance Richard was beginning to see. His pen tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion, but it carried weight, because it was the first visible break in his usual composure, and around the table, attention shifted toward him more directly now, the room recalibrating, waiting, sensing that the trajectory of the meeting had subtly altered, while beyond the closed door, in the quiet hallway where she had been left behind, Ava Johnson remained exactly where she was. Unaware of the exact moment inside when the lines she had pointed out stopped being dismissed and started being examined, but certain that it would happen, because truth did not need volume to be heard, it only needed time and the right pair of eyes to recognize it. The explanation in the room continued, but it no longer carried the same weight it had minutes earlier, because now every word was being measured against something unseen, something that had entered quietly and refused to leave, and Richard Coleman leaned back slightly in his chair, not in comfort but in recalibration, his fingers steepled for a moment before lowering again to the document, while the attorney across from him adjusted his posture and began to elaborate further, layering technical assurances over the clause in question, explaining how the language aligned with industry standards, how contingencies were accounted for, how the structure had been reviewed by multiple teams, and on the surface, it all held together, it sounded complete, polished, difficult to challenge, yet beneath that surface, the imbalance remained, subtle but persistent, like a note just slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect composition. One of the senior board members nodded along, tapping his pen lightly against his folder, while another glanced toward the opposing representatives, searching for confirmation in their calm expressions, but those expressions had not changed, still composed, still confident, still waiting, and that waiting began to feel deliberate, as if they were allowing the room to convince itself. Richard's gaze shifted from the clause to the margin, then to the preceding paragraph, then forward again, tracing the dependency between sections, following the chain of responsibility not just as it was written, but as it would function under pressure, and that was where the structure began to reveal itself, not in the language alone, but in the consequence it would produce if triggered, because the clause did not fail outright, it redirected, quietly, efficiently, moving the burden from one side to the other under conditions that appeared reasonable until examined in sequence. His jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, placing the pen down this time, a deliberate motion that drew a few eyes toward him, and he asked for the scenario to be walked through step by step, not in theory, but in application, requesting clarity on what would happen if a post-merger compliance issue emerged within the first 12 months, and the attorney paused again, longer this time, before answering, outlining the process, the arbitration, the allocation of responsibility, but as he spoke, the clarity did not sharpen. It blurred because each step introduced a layer that deferred accountability. Until it landed fully on Richard's side of the agreement, a faint shift moved through the room, chairs adjusting, papers sliding slightly, the kind of movement that signaled attention had narrowed, that something once assumed safe was now being reconsidered, and one of the analysts quietly pulled the document closer, scanning the same section, his brow tightening as he read, while another executive stopped mid-note, his pen hovering above the page. The representative from the opposing firm remained still, hands folded, expression unchanged, but the stillness now felt heavier, less like confidence and more like calculation. And Richard noticed that too, the absence of interruption, the lack of urgency to clarify, as if the silence itself was part of the design. Outside, the hallway remained quiet, the soft hum of the building continuing without concern for what was unfolding inside, and Ava Johnson shifted her weight slightly, not out of impatience, but because time had begun to stretch, her eyes still fixed on the door that separated her from a room she had already influenced without being allowed to remain in it. And she did not need to hear the conversation to know its direction, because the moment Richard asked for the scenario, the outcome had already begun to change, and back inside, he closed the document halfway, not fully, not decisively, but enough to signal a pause that could no longer be ignored, his voice steady when he spoke again, asking one final question, quieter than the others, but sharper. Who carries the full liability if that clause is triggered exactly as written? And this time, the answer did not come immediately, and in that delay, the room felt it, the shift from certainty to exposure, from control to realization, and the silence that followed was no longer comfortable. No one answered him right away, and that silence did not feel accidental, it felt exposed, like a structure that had been leaning unnoticed was suddenly seen from the right angle, and Richard Coleman did not repeat the question. He did not need to, because the absence of an immediate response had already begun to answer it, while across the table the lead attorney adjusted his glasses, flipping back a page that had already been read. As if the motion itself might buy time, his voice measured. When it finally came, explaining that under specific interpretations the liability could be shared depending on regulatory triggers and dispute outcomes, but the phrasing lacked the certainty it carried before, and that shift did not go unnoticed, not by Richard, not by the others whose attention had narrowed into something sharper now, more cautious, because they were no longer listening for reassurance, they were listening for gaps. One of the board members leaned forward, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, asking for a direct answer, not a conditional one, and the attorney hesitated again, this time longer, his eyes moving briefly toward the representatives from the opposing firm before returning to the page, and in that small movement, the room felt it, the alignment that should have been transparent now appearing coordinated, controlled, and that realization spread quietly, not through words, but through posture. Through the way shoulders stiffened and eyes began to move more deliberately across the document, Richard reached for the contract again, turning to the exact section Ava had identified, his fingers tracing the clause not as language, but as consequence, and when he followed it to its endpoint, there was no ambiguity left. The liability did not disperse, it converged, fully, decisively, onto his company if triggered under the conditions outlined, conditions that were not rare, not extreme, but entirely plausible within the first year of integration, and that was when the weight of it settled, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet certainty that was far more dangerous than panic. The analyst who had been scanning the page earlier leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, while another executive placed his pen down with a soft click, no longer writing, because the assumptions that had supported their confidence were beginning to collapse, piece by piece, and the representative from the opposing firm, who had remained composed until now, shifted almost imperceptibly, his hands tightening slightly before relaxing again, as if recalibrating a position that had just been seen too clearly. Richard closed the document this time, not halfway, but completely, the sound of the pages meeting final. Controlled, and when he looked up, his expression had changed, not into anger, not into frustration, but into something far more precise, awareness, and he spoke without raising his voice, asking why this clause had not been flagged during internal review, why a provision with this level of exposure had been allowed to pass through multiple layers without escalation, and no one answered immediately, because the truth was not simple. It was systemic, buried in process and assumption, and in that moment, the room understood something else, something quieter but just as significant, that the person who had identified it first was no longer in the room. Outside, the hallway remained unchanged, the lighting steady, the distant hum continuing as if nothing had shifted at all, and Ava Johnson stood where she had been left, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but now there was a subtle difference, not in her expression, but in the air around her, as if the outcome she had anticipated was moving closer, step by step, unfolding behind a door she had already influenced without permission, and inside that room, the realization completed itself, not with a declaration, but with a shared understanding that they had been seconds away from signing something they did not fully control, and the only person who had seen it clearly had been escorted out before anyone thought to listen. The room did not erupt into chaos, it tightened, like a space that had suddenly become too small for the truth it now held, and Richard Coleman remained still for a moment after closing the contract, his fingers resting flat against the cover as if anchoring the decision that had not yet been spoken aloud, while around him the others shifted in quiet, controlled ways, chairs adjusting, papers aligning. Eyes no longer wandering but fixed, because something fundamental had changed, not the deal itself, but their understanding of it. The silence stretched, not empty, but full, heavy with realization, and in that stillness Richard's gaze moved slowly across the table, not searching for answers anymore, but measuring reactions, the attorney who had spoken with certainty now looking down at his notes. The analyst who had leaned back now leaning forward again, rechecking the numbers as if hoping they might resolve differently the second time, and the representatives from the opposing firms sitting composed but no longer untouched, their stillness now edged with awareness that the structure they had relied on had been seen too clearly. Richard inhaled once, controlled, steady, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise. But it carried through the room with a clarity that shifted everything. "We are not signing this today." And no one interrupted, no one challenged it, because the authority in that statement did not come from position alone, it came from the undeniable logic that had just unfolded, and the weight of what had nearly happened settled across the table, not as panic, but as something colder, more precise, a recognition of proximity, how close they had come to a decision that would have reshaped not just their balance sheet, but the lives connected to it, thousands of employees, years of work, all redirected by a clause that had been overlooked. One of the board members exhaled quietly, rubbing his temple, while another closed his folder without speaking, the sound soft but final, and the attorney began to respond, offering to revise, to renegotiate, to clarify language, but the momentum had shifted beyond adjustments, because the issue was no longer just the clause, it was trust. The foundation beneath the agreement now fractured, and Richard raised a hand. Slightly, not to silence, but to pause, his focus no longer on explanation, but on origin, on how this had entered the room at all. Outside, the hallway remained unchanged, the fluorescent light steady, the polished floor reflecting the same quiet stillness it had held all morning, and Ava Johnson stood there, her posture relaxed but grounded, her hands loosely folded now, not waiting with anxiety, but with a calm that came from knowing something had already moved in her absence, and the security guards nearby had begun to glance toward the boardroom door more frequently, sensing a shift they could not name, because even without hearing the conversation, the tension inside had begun to leak into the space beyond it, subtle but real. Back inside, Richard's gaze returned briefly to the closed door, not as an afterthought, but as a connection, the moment replaying in his mind, the voice, the precision, the clarity that had cut through layers of assumption, and for the first time since the meeting began, he acknowledged it fully, not just as an interruption, but as the turning point, and the realization settled quietly that the most critical insight in the room had come from someone they had not even allowed to stay, and that recognition did not come with immediate action, it came with a pause, a breath, a recalibration of what mattered, because before anything else could continue, there was something that needed to be corrected, not in the document, but in the way they had chosen to listen. The realization did not explode into motion, it sharpened into urgency, quiet but unmistakable, and Richard Coleman stood from his chair with a precision that drew every eye in the room without a single word needing to be raised, his hand resting briefly on the edge of the table as if grounding the decision before it fully formed, and when he looked toward the door this time, it was not a passing glance, it was intent. Clear and immediate. "Bring her back," he said, and the instruction did not echo, it cut cleanly through the room, leaving no space for interpretation, and for a fraction of a second no one moved, not because they did not understand, but because the shift was so complete it needed a moment to be processed, and then one of the assistants near the wall turned quickly, stepping out into the hallway with a speed that broke the stillness. The door opening and closing again with a controlled urgency that had not existed before. Outside, the change was immediate, the assistant's voice low but firm as he approached the security guards, asking where the girl had been taken, and the guards straightened, exchanging a glance that now carried a different weight, no longer routine, no longer dismissive, but uncertain, because the situation they thought was resolved had suddenly reversed, and Ava Johnson turned her head slightly as the assistant approached, her expression steady, not surprised, not startled, just attentive, as if she had been expecting something to shift, though not necessarily this quickly. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere continued to compress, the silence now filled with something more than realization, something closer to accountability, and Richard remained standing, his posture no longer relaxed, his focus fixed. Because the moment had passed where this could be handled quietly within the room, it had already extended beyond it, into the hallway, into the space where the person who had seen what they had missed was still standing, waiting without knowing she was about to be called back. One of the board members spoke softly, almost to himself, acknowledging what had just happened, that they had nearly committed to something irreversible, and another nodded, slower, more deliberate, the weight of the near mistake settling into something personal now. Not just strategic. And the attorney who had defended the clause earlier sat back, his hands folded, no longer offering explanations, because the conversation had moved past defense into recognition. Seconds stretched, each one measured, and then the door opened again, not abruptly, but with purpose, and the assistant stepped back into the room, his voice controlled but edged with something new. "She is still outside." And Richard gave a single nod, a motion that carried more than instruction, it carried correction, and the assistant stepped aside, holding. The door opened this time, not as a barrier, but as an invitation reversed. Ava paused for the briefest moment before stepping forward, her shoes quiet against the marble as she crossed the threshold again. The same room, the same people, but nothing felt the same now, because the space that had rejected her minutes ago was now waiting for her to return, and as she entered, no one spoke immediately, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent the moment, but just in time to understand it, and Richard Coleman watched her step fully into the room, his expression no longer distant, no longer dismissive, but focused, aware, as if he was seeing her clearly. For the first time, not as someone who did not belong, but as the one person who had understood exactly what was at stake before anyone else in the room had even begun to question it. No one spoke when Ava Johnson stepped fully into the room, but the silence this time was different. It was not dismissal, not indifference, it was attention, focused and undivided, and she paused just inside the doorway for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to take in the shift that had occurred in her absence. The same polished table, the same faces, yet the air had changed, heavier, more aware. And Richard Coleman remained standing at the head of the table, his posture no longer commanding in the way it had been before, but grounded, deliberate, as if he understood that authority alone was no longer enough in this moment. He gestured lightly toward the table, not as an order, but as an invitation, and Ava stepped forward, her movements calm, measured, her gaze steady as it passed across the documents, the screens, the people who had moments earlier dismissed her presence entirely. And when she stopped near the edge of the table, she did not speak immediately, she did not assert herself, she simply waited, because she understood something that the room was only now beginning to grasp, that clarity did not need urgency, it needed precision. Richard picked up the contract again, opening it to the exact page she had referenced, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, not authority imposed, but acknowledgement earned. "Show me," he said, not as a challenge, but as a request, and the shift in those two words did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Ava reached forward, her fingers resting lightly on the page, not rushed, not tentative, and she pointed to the clause, then moved slightly upward, tracing the dependency between sections with a quiet confidence that came from understanding, not assumption. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, explaining how the language redirected liability under specific conditions. How the phrasing created an illusion of shared responsibility while actually consolidating risk. And she did not use complicated language, she did not try to impress, she simply made it clear, step by step, following the structure until the outcome could no longer be interpreted any other way. The room listened, truly listened now, not because of who she was, but because of what she was showing them, and as she spoke, the pieces aligned, not through persuasion, but through logic. Each connection reinforcing the next until the full shape of the clause became undeniable. One of the executives leaned forward, nodding slowly. As he followed her explanation, another flipped back through the document to confirm the references, and the attorney who had defended the clause earlier remained silent, his expression no longer guarded, but reflective, as if recalculating everything he had previously accepted without question. Richard's eyes did not leave the page, his focus fixed on the path Ava was outlining, and when she finished, she did not look up for approval, she simply withdrew her hand, allowing the information to settle, because she understood that the truth did not need reinforcement once it had been seen clearly. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of recognition, of realization, of the quiet weight that comes when something important has been corrected just in time, and Richard finally closed the document again, slower this time, not abrupt, not final, but intentional, and when he looked at Ava, there was no trace of dismissal left, only respect, measured and genuine, because in a room built on power, she had not demanded space, she had simply revealed what others had missed, and in doing so, she had changed the direction of everything without raising her voice, without claiming authority, only by being right. The room did not return to what it had been, it settled into something quieter, something more honest, as if the air itself had adjusted to hold a different kind of weight, and no one rushed to speak because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the quiet understanding of what had almost happened and what had just been prevented. And Richard Coleman remained standing for a moment longer before slowly taking his seat again, the movement unhurried, deliberate, his hand resting briefly on the closed contract as if acknowledging it, not as a victory, but as a decision that would now be carried differently. Across the table, papers were no longer being shuffled with urgency, screens dimmed slightly as hands pulled away, and the earlier tension that had filled the space had softened into reflection, the kind that does not demand attention but stays present, steady, unavoidable, while one by one the executives leaned back, their posture no longer defensive, no longer certain, but thoughtful, recalibrating silently in the aftermath of something that had shifted beneath them. Ava Johnson stood near the edge of the table, not claiming the space, not stepping further in, her presence quiet but grounded, and she did not look around for recognition, she did not wait for acknowledgement, because she understood that what mattered had already happened. And that recognition, if it came, would come in its own time, without her asking for it. The light from the tall windows stretched across the polished surface of the table, catching the edges of the document, reflecting softly against the glass walls that had once made her feel like she was on the outside looking in, and now those same reflections held her within the room without resistance, without question, as if the space itself had adjusted to include her, somewhere beyond the walls. The faint hum of the building continued, distant elevators moving, quiet footsteps passing in the hallway, the world outside unchanged, unaware of the small but significant correction that had just taken place inside this room, and that contrast settled into the moment, reminding everyone present how easily something critical could be missed in plain sight. Richard's gaze lifted briefly, not toward the document, not toward the others, but toward Ava, and there was no urgency in it, no need to speak. Only a quiet acknowledgement that did not require words, his expression steady, reflective, carrying the weight of someone who had just seen something clearly that he had overlooked before, and in that stillness, there was a shift not just in the decision that had been made, but in the way it had been made, and the understanding of where clarity could come from, and who might hold it. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, her hands relaxed, her breathing even, and after a moment she turned toward the door, not abruptly, not as if leaving something behind, but as if continuing forward, her steps soft against the floor, each one steady, unhurried. And no one stopped her, no one called out, because there was nothing to add, nothing to correct, only the quiet presence of what had already been understood. The door opened without resistance this time, the hallway beyond just as it had been before, and as she stepped through, the light shifted slightly across the floor, the reflection changing for a brief second before settling again, and behind her, the room remained still, not empty, but quiet, holding the echo of a moment where power had paused long enough to listen. And in that pause something had been set right without noise, without spectacle, only through clarity, and the kind of strength that does not need to be seen to be real.